When the theater doors sighed open each morning, the smell rolled in like a history. Old velvet, dust that had settled into the wood for decades, the faint tang of stage paint, and the ghost of perfume from a million matinees. Maria had learned those smells the way some people learn prayers, by repetition and by heart. She worked nights and mornings for the small theater company on the corner of Vasari and 3rd, sweeping ash from the wings after opera rehearsals, folding the dressing room towels, pressing gowns on the ironing board until the creases held like promises. The theater paid just enough to keep rent paid and bread bought. It fed her in a different way, a roof over small, practical griefs, and a place where music lived, soft and immediate, whenever the actors practiced or the company ran through areas. On the first afternoon, the orchestra came back into the city for the season's gala, the foyer filled with people who smelled like money and expectation. Voices rose and fell like the tremble of an instrument. Between them moved a man whose presence cut everything else into background, Vittorio Bennett, Maestro, whose name had the weight of a verdict on it. He carried himself like a baton in human form. Lean, precise, with knuckles that seemed to be perpetually holding an invisible score. His eyes were pale and habitually narrowed, always assessing, always finishing the sentence in his mind before the other had spoken. Maria first noticed him because of the way the cleaner's door banged open, loud enough to startle, and because he looked directly at her. Their eyes met only for a moment. She was leaning on an ironing board, her hands damp from starch, a towel looped over one shoulder, her hair stuck slightly to her neck where the room was warm. She felt, absurdly, like someone who had been caught humming in a church. The maestro's mouth made a small scoff. "You're not in costume, Signora?" he said, voice smooth and polished. "Are you here for the gala?" "No, Signor," Maria said, wiping her hands on a rag. There was, she thought, an honesty to the rag that had no need for charm. "I work here." He walked closer, measuring, as if he were sizing up tempo before a downbeat. "You sound as if you belong to the back of the house," he observed. "Do you sing?" The question hung between them. Maria's hands had been folded around the ironing board. Her father had taught her to sing before he taught her anything else that mattered. The pitch of a note left in someone's chest, the cadence of a phrase learned from the river when they were small. He had died with a pair of worn shoes and a hymnal in his hand, and Maria had disguised her music as lullabies for her son and hums while she pressed collars. The word, sing, had both the taste of honey and the ache of guilt. It felt indulgent wherever she kept her errands. "Yes," she admitted. It was as much a confession as an answer. "I like folk voices," Vittorio said, something like amusement in the rise of his brow. "They are charming, in a provincial sort of way. But this gala will host professional numbers. We cannot have charm substituting for technique." Maria's cheeks warmed. "I didn't mean. No." He tapped the program in his hand. "I have a policy, Signora. We audition only conservatory-trained singers with formal backgrounds. But," and here his voice slid soft as velvet with a hint of cruelty, "if you insist, you may come tomorrow at noon. We'll listen, and if I find you likable enough, I will find you useful." The qualifiers felt thinner than paper and twice as sharp. When his staff fluttered protection around his shoulders, the maestro smiled at them the way someone smiles to instruct. They were the audience for his wit. Maria's world narrowed, then widened. She could afford to, she told herself, to be in the back of the house, to be a seamstress and a janitor, and a person of harmless, private songs. But there was a part of her that had, since the funeral and the burns of younger grief, stored the songs as if they were pieces of a map to a place she might not be allowed to enter. That night she went home with fingers that smelled of starch and coal and a small, absurd resolve. She had, in the years of careful smallness, been saving a single voice. Her son, Loka, had left for the provinces on a summer wind and stayed gone longer than any map promised. The songs belonged to her and to the man who had believed she could sing, and so she hung the rag to dry and practiced in the apartment where the radiator hissed like an off-key flute. The next day, Daniel found her in the wings. He was young, 23, perhaps with a pianist's hands and the earnest look of someone who had read too many biographies of struggling geniuses and decided to join the rote anyway. He was Maestro Bennett's assistant, though he did not wear the shield of seniority that a name could offer. He had been the one who'd introduced technical scores to the theater's more informal musicians, who'd stayed late to show and accompanist the vocal coloring trinities. To Maria, he was an ally in whose gaze she felt less like an intruder. "You can come in," Daniel said, as if the building itself had been consulted. He wore a brow-staining expression of nervous compassion. "Bennett's in rehearsal. He's merciless, but if you sing, I'll be there to play." She had thought to say no. Instead, she nodded. Rehearsal was work like a storm. Vittorio conducted with knives of thought. The violinists looked like they were carving wood. The cellists looked like they were cradling secrets. Maria sat in the dark wings and watched light on music stands and the way people's faces changed when they met a difficult passage. He was ruthless with phrasing, impatient with sentimentality. Once, when a soprano let a phrase linger too long, he threw his head back and said, "No. Chop the fat. You are not a bath. You are a blade." The individual cruelty of that metaphor lodged in Maria like a thorn. After rehearsal, Daniel led her into a small practice room, its walls lined with soundproofing foam and sticky with humidity. He set his fingers on the keys, raw and bright. She felt ridiculous, like a child playing dress up in an adult's sorrow. But when she opened her mouth, the notes came as if they had been waiting with her. They were not trained with the glossy perfection Vittorio worshipped. They were rough on the edges, like river stones. They carried a tremor of years, the kind of intonation that has lived through weather. Daniel listened with his whole body. He watched her chin, the way she used breath like a small economy, the way the vowels fell into place with the honest, stubborn logic of someone who had learned to sing through necessity. "You have something," he said simply at the end. "Something that's not in the conservatory books. I can work with that." "You're not afraid of Bennett?" Maria asked. The maestro was a dark presence. She thought she could see him, between rehearsals, like the theater's own weather. Daniel smiled, and it held more fatigue than bravado. "Bennett is afraid of what he cannot control. The world is full of that. We'll make you controlled." They practiced for 3 weeks. Maria learned to hold a phrase longer than her breath wanted to place a soft vibrato like a salt pinch. Daniel taught her how to eat air without letting it go. How to make silence a partner, not an enemy. They hunched over the Steinway until the varnish smelled like something that had been loved into a crease. There was one afternoon Maria could never forget. Rain splattered the windows like applause, and she sang a low folk lullaby her father had taught her, the kind of song that keeps watch. Daniel's hands stilled. "It's not that you don't have technique," he said finally. "It's that you make technique into a language for what you feel." Word of a simple woman. Singing traveled, as words do in small theaters, and visited the maestro like a small, black pebble lodging in an expensive shoe. He could not have tolerated the idea that the prodigy of a backdoor could upstage his curated program. He had been born to trim phrases until the public agreed and his reputation remained flawless. When he learned that Maria was to perform a short, unassuming number at the community slot of the gala, part novelty, part outreach, he lifted his chin in a way that did not forgive. "Tell her to keep it brief," he said to Daniel in a corridor that smelled of rosin and coffee. We will not sully the evening with sentimentalities. She is sincere, Daniel insisted. That matters. Sincerity is not a stand-in for training, Vittorio said, and his voice carried inside the hall like a cold draft. We'll have to give the audience what they paid for: gorgeousness, representational excellence. That's not how music becomes alive, Daniel said. The idea lingered between them like an accusation. You can be excellent without being stiff, Maestro. Vittorio's jaw tightened. Pride was the last thing he would confess to owning. Instead, he said, "Bring the woman. I will listen. I will decide." Mockery has a peculiar way of becoming a vow. The Maestro's lowered expectation became, for Maria, a threshold. She balanced the weight of it with the lightness of her father's lullaby, which sat in her like a seed. She thought of how he had hummed in the dark, his voice thin but firm, and how he had said, "Sing, Maria, sing so the stones remember you." The phrase had felt like a child's instruction, and also a map. On the night of the gala, the auditorium glittered with candlelight and a bounty of silk. People whispered in the plush seats. The Maestro glided onto the stage in his tux, and the moment the music swelled, the audience leaned forward to taste perfection. Maria sat with the volunteer chorus in the upper wings, her hands clammy, a small bouquet of wildflowers. Rosa's strategy for calming nerves pressed to her chest. Rosa, head of the theater's volunteers, was the person responsible for dragging Maria into all this. She was a broad woman with round hands and a laugh that could lift a roof. "You will be magnificent," she told Maria, and meant it. The first part of the program came like a carefully staged procession. Arias polished, until they could reflect the chandeliers, violin solos that came through like polished adages. Vittorio conducted as if he were sweeping ants into a line. Masterful, almost terrifying. Maria felt herself shrinking until she could hear the sound of her own breath like someone else's wind. Then, oddly, fate or design or reckless generosity intervened. In the interval, an emergency, a soprano had a flare of illness, and the Maestro's chosen soloist collapsed under a sudden tremble. The theater murmured. Vittorio's face was unreadable. The orchestra stuttered like a machine losing power. Someone at the back of the stage gestured. The program was in jeopardy. In the wings, decisions happened in seconds. Daniel looked at Maria and, without asking, began to hand over the accompaniment sheets. "You?" It wasn't a question. "You'll do the bridge piece. Just your piece. Keep it simple. Keep it true." Maria thought of saying no, of stepping back to the safety of her small life and a slower, cleaner grief. But Rosa's hand was on her shoulder, warm and insistent. "You'll be a candle in the hole tonight," Rosa said, using the only metaphor she ever had. Maria had once been a candle in a hole, steady, bright enough to guide lost hands. Now she moved forward, and the wings of the theater felt like a throat. The Maestro watched her with the same thin, surgical gaze. He did not smile. The orchestra arranged themselves around her. She caught his eye. There was a tiny thing like a question in the lines of his face. And she realized, with a rush, that the man sitting in the audience's reverent silence could see the same stage she did. She felt, suddenly, the absurd impossibility of it all: her ragged voice in that auditorium, her father's lullaby possibly crossing a room that felt like marble and gold. When she stepped onto the stage, the hush of the audience folded over her. The lights were warm and as large as suns. She felt the heat on her face like weather. The first note left like an offering, not trained to the polish of conservatory arcs, but honest. It bent and leaned into the orchestra like someone seeking a hand in the dark. What she sang was not a concert aria. It was a song that belonged to riverbanks, to bread shared on a cracked table, to the teenage mornings when she hid in a doorway and held herself while her father left for work. It contained wrong notes, like honest bruises. It contained ornaments learned from listening to birds rather than teachers. Daniel's hands were a gentle tide, carrying her phrases without drowning them. For a while she thought no one was listening. Then she felt the first out of place breath in the house. A man near the third row had set down an evening program and had forgotten to look at it. Vittorio's back straightened. In his conduct, the baton paused as if it had caught a new instruction. His eyes, sharp and clinical, began to leak a different feeling. Surprise, and then something that might be recalibration. The song told a story of someone who had given away small, everyday gifts and never been thanked, with the deep, private belief that gifts are worthwhile not because they make headlines, but because they rescue the giver from a practical loneliness. Maria's voice carried that belief into the hall. It threaded the area's technical scaffolding with a living muscle, beating in the places where the audience lived. She sang about the old father and about the laundromat near the river and about a child who left one year and didn't return the next. She sang about holding grief like a thread and using it to stitch something larger. Music has gravity. It can make the air in a room thicker, like syrup, and it can press on ribs and make people remember things they had forgotten. It can also pull out of a person their own hidden stories. As Maria sang, a woman in the fifth row touched the corner of her mouth like she was making sure it was a real smile. A man in the loge began to cry silently, his shoulders shaking. People who had come to witness virtuosity now felt themselves invited into something intimate. The sense of watching pure technique melted like snow on an old bench. Vittorio watched and then closed his eyes. He had, for decades, been building a life to keep sentiment at bay. That night, sentiment breached his armor. He had spent a career shaping sound into something that could be judged rather than felt. He had believed that music must be trimmed and trimmed again so that no living wildness intruded. Watching Maria, he realized that he had been as careful with his own life, cutting away elements that didn't polish his name until his private music had been clipped out of him. When Maria reached the song's last lines, a simple phrase her father had repeated like an incantation, the room leaned toward her as though pulled by an unseen hand. She ended on a note that was not meant to be flawless. It trembled like a leaf, and then it landed, sealed by silence. The silence became an ocean. For a moment, nothing breathed. Then someone, Rosa, Maria thought, stood and clapped. At first it was a single palm, awkward and sincere. The sound spread, contagious and honest. The house rose like a tide. Standing ovations are, in their purest form, a decision to move from spectator to witness and to insist that a person be acknowledged. This night the ovation rolled and swelled until it was impossible to contain. Maria felt hands around her like tides. She tried to bow and then to flee, but the stage held. Vittorio was still seated when the applause began. His face was unreadable. For a long second, he did not stand. It would have been easy to toss off a scornful remark about amateurs and truth disguised as passion. But what he felt instead, he had no name for it, moved like a bruise under the sternum, raw and deep. He rose slowly, as if from a formal habit he had believed to be rightful and eternal. When he stood, the applause found him and turned its direction. He watched Maria with an attention he had not afforded a singer in years, a look like someone seeing a familiar landscape, now lit by a different map. Backstage, Maria sat with her face in her hands. She felt as if she had been lived through. Her heart was a small animal that had run and now sought shelter. Daniel's hand found her head, and in that pressure she felt more gratitude than she had words for. Rosa hugged her until she smelled of powder and lavender and the particular heat of a woman who has known 100 nights like this and still, like an unwrapping, finds one new. The Maestro came behind the wings then. Maria heard first the click of his shoes, the metronome of grandeur, and then the rustle of a coat. She expected to be chastised, to be offered a consoling word that was actually a reprimand. Instead, Vittorio stopped a few feet away, and what he said was both more and less than she had imagined. "You have an ugly, beautiful voice," he said. It was the kind of compliment that tore open definitions. Ugly, he meant, in the sense of rawness, a sound not smoothed for gilding. Beautiful, he meant, because something raw and true had been rescued and placed like an offering. She wanted to ask which he preferred. Instead, she listened. "You sing as if you have nothing to cover," Vittorio continued. "You do not hide the seams. Most of us spend our lives sewing them shut." Maria inched her head up. "I do not know how to sew seams shut," she said. Her voice sounded small and uneven in the backstage, as if it did not fit in with the velvet and the cables and the heat lamps. "You do not need to," he said. He reached into his inner pocket and produced a small handkerchief, embroidered with a single neat V. A silly object of vanity, she thought, but he did not give it to her. He held it out and then drew it back. Technique is not a way to erase life. It's a way to bring it forward with intention, if you allow it. His words were an offering and an assignment. In the days after, the papers would speak of the night a simple woman had humiliated an icon. They would place the story in headlines as if a contest had been fought and a victor crowned. People would sketch caricatures of Vittorio's shock. But for Maria, the truth was simpler. Someone who had once thought the world shaped by rigid standards had, in one night, seen a possibility he'd been denying himself. For Daniel, the moment was a vindication of his conviction. The belief that music needs bridges. The public attention that came after was a kind of tide that reshaped every small shore in Maria's life. Invitations came in polite envelopes. A modest concert series asked for her to return. Students and mothers from immigrant neighborhoods wrote to the theater, saying that if a seamstress could be heard at the opera house, then perhaps their children might have other doors opened. With each invitation, Maria thought of the laundromat where she had pressed shirts until the collars held like small flags. She thought of the husband she had once almost married and then left because he wanted her to stay invisible. She thought of her father's calloused hands and the way he prayed with no congregation, but had a faith that was as simple as a hymn. And yet, everything did not untangle into a neat, new fabric. Fame arrives like a sudden high tide, beautiful, but it erodes edges. Maria had to learn how to make money off of music, which felt for a moment like learning to sell a secret. She made choices that did not always feel right. She let a small record label sign her for a modest deal and then winced when editors smoothed her voice in places that had been beloved for their roughness. There were nights she stood in rooms full of people waiting to be dazzled and had to summon again and again the first courage required to step onto a stage with a song that belonged to a laundry in a river. Vittorio watched her in the seasons that followed. He sought her out not quite for rivalry and not quite for kinship. He invited her to rehearse with the orchestra, and his presence in those rooms changed. He softened, perhaps, but also learned. He conducted differently near her, permitting breaths that once would have been cut. He began, reluctantly at first, and then, with an emerging appetite, to study the places where folk and classical traditions touched. People called it an artistic conversion. Few understood the domesticities. How a man, built of modulations and public applause, had been rendered unarmored by an unpruned song. One evening, after a rehearsal where they had worked on an arrangement that braided her lullaby through a chamber piece, Vittorio handed Maria that small embroidered handkerchief. "Keep the seams if you must," he said, and his voice had a tremor she could not have expected. "But tend them with skill." Maria accepted it. She tucked the cloth into her coat pocket, where it warmed against her heart like a small map. Years later, When she came back to the theater for a retrospective and found the auditorium less gilded but full of a new kind of audience. Mothers, seamstresses, the young men from the provinces who had learned to tune their grief into art. She thought not of triumph but of allegiance. Standing at the center of the stage, she felt the presence of all the small acts that had made the evening possible. A father's hum, the starch on collars, the way Daniel had thumbed a page with impatience, and then devotion, Rosa's laugh like a steering wheel. She had not turned her life into a legend. She had turned it into a life that could be sung. The Maestro sat in the audience that night, older in the way paper yellows. He raised his hand after the curtain call, not in the brusque fashion of a man who wanted power, but in the soft way of someone who had learned the cost of being right all the time. When Maria caught his eye, he nodded. It was a small nod, a recognition that owed nothing to the press or the thunder of applause. It was a quiet absolution, and for Maria, standing under the lights that had once seemed like suns, something else shifted. She thought of a river and how it never asked for permission to shape stones. She thought of the old hymn her father had sung and how it had taught her that faith is not spectacle, but the steady act of showing up. The standing ovation had not been an answer to hunger or a remedy to poverty. It was proof that sometimes voice and truth meet and make a bridge wide enough for both ordinary and exalted people to cross. After the applause, as the house emptied into the night, and the theater exhaled its long day, Maria walked through the stage doors. The air outside smelled of rain and laundromat steam, her two homes in the world. She tucked the handkerchief back into her pocket and, for the first time in a long while, hummed the tune not for practice but simply because the air demanded it. A child at the corner looked up, hearing the song, and smiled in a way that made Maria's chest ache with gratitude. She had come, once, as a simple woman who feared being laughed at. She walked away as someone who had learned that simplicity could be fierce. The Maestro, whose expertise had once been a wall, had become a doorway. And in the theater's twilight, everything altered just enough. The seams were visible, and they were beautiful.